It hit me like a scene from a cartoon where a light bulb suddenly appears above a character Essie head. I realized my third child wasn't mine. She was fathered by another man. This dawned on me while I was on a call with a representative trying to figure out why my daughter's DNA test results hadn't shown up after 10 weeks. It was supposed to be an extra Christmas gift. After I gave the representative all the necessary details, he put me on hold. 5 minutes later, he returned and confirmed that the test had indeed been processed, but he couldn't give me more information due to privacy policies. Confused, I questioned, if it's been processed, why isn't it appearing in my DNA results? I was hoping for a clear answer. The representative, sounding a bit exasperated, replied, "Sir, there are several reasons why your daughter might not show up in your DNA matches, but I can discuss this particular test with you." That S, when it struck me like a sledgehammer, the most obvious reason she wasn't appearing was that she wasn't biologically related to me. I ended the call feeling dazed. I remember pressing the red end call button and then collapsing into tears. A few minutes later, I found myself curled up on the couch in the family room. With 15 minutes left on my lunch break, I decided to call my daughter. We both worked in the same time zone, and I knew she usually read a book at her desk during lunch, so I wasn't worried about disturbing her. She answered on the first ring, sounding a bit tired. "Hi, Dad, how are you?" I took a deep breath and said, "Honey, I love you and trust you completely, but I found out about the DNA test. I called the company and they said it was processed 2 weeks ago." There was a moment of silence, and I could hear her taking a deep breath on the other end. "I know, Dad, we need to talk, but not now. Call me tonight and make sure Mom isn't around," she said, her voice trembling. Driving back to the office felt surreal, and I have to admit I got nothing done that afternoon. My mind was racing with questions and fears, especially the terrifying thought that my beloved daughter might not be mine. Being a logical person, I knew I needed to handle this systematically. As Vice President of Engineering, I was used to dealing with complex problems. My mentor, Roger, had taught me to approach personal issues like project challenges. Under Roger's guidance, I had helped grow his small company into a major player in the industry, and we both enjoyed financial success. I had a great salary, excellent benefits, and worked with brilliant colleagues. Plus, I had a beautiful, charming wife and 3 wonderful kids waiting for me at home every evening. The kids had grown up, moved out, and started their own families. At first, the empty house felt lonely, but Rachel and I found ways to enjoy our time together. I thought the peace and quiet had even strengthened our relationship. But now, thinking back over the past month, a few odd incidents stood out. Like Jessica's call to my wife 2 weeks ago. One Tuesday night, while Rachel and I were watching TV, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen, said it was Jessica, and answered it. Their conversation was brief, with Rachel mostly saying yes and no. I noticed tears in her eyes when she hung up. I asked if everything was all right. She said Jessica's cat was sick and tried to brush it off, but I sensed she was uneasy. It struck me as odd how affected she was by Jessica's cat's problems. Little did I know that might have been the moment Jessica found out the truth. Rachel didn't know about the DNA test I had secretly sent to Jessica. I didn't think it was important enough to mention. Jessica was the only one of our kids interested in genealogy, so I thought she'd enjoy it. I had been researching our family's history for years and loved the DNA aspect. I assumed Jessica would feel the same. Clearly, I was wrong. When I got home, I made sure not to treat Rachel any differently, even though I was in turmoil inside. I kept telling myself to tackle one problem at a time. I met Rachel in my sophomore year of university, but we didn't start dating until my senior year. Since then, we had been inseparable, at least from my perspective. We got married a year after graduating, and I still thought it was the best decision I ever made. At 54, she still looked stunning, maintaining her beauty and fit body through regular workouts. She was fun and full of humor, and until now, I had looked forward to spending the rest of my life with her. Around 8:00, I told Rachel I needed to make a call to my mentor about a project and excused myself. I grabbed my jacket and went out to the porch swing to make the call privately. I dialed Jessica's number, my heart pounding. Jessica answered on the first ring, sounding distressed. "Dad, I am so sorry. "I should have told you earlier, but Mom asked me to keep quiet until she talked to you," she whispered, not even giving me a chance to say hello. "Hey, I am not mad at you. Take a deep breath," I said, trying to calm her. "I am not blaming you. You are as much a victim in this as I am." I could hear her struggling to breathe normally. "This changes nothing between us. I am still your dad, and you will always be my little girl. I have loved you and your siblings all these years, and that is not going to change unless you want it to." She broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. "I love you, Daddy. I don't need anyone else but you," Jessica said softly. I gently told her that I didn't want to put her on the spot, but she was my best source for DNA information. I promised we wouldn't get into anything else so she wouldn't feel caught in the middle. I needed to know if she had any DNA matches. She sighed and said, "Emma Johnson turned out to be my half-sister." I was stunned. "You mean Emma, Uncle Michael, and Aunt Sarah's daughter?" I asked. She confirmed with a quiet yes. I reassured her that it wasn't her fault and she never needed to apologize to me. The revelation that Michael Johnson, known to my kids as Uncle Michael and respected by the world as Judge Michael Johnson, was Jessica's biological father, hit me hard. This meant my wife had an affair with her boss when he was still an attorney at the law firm over 25 years ago. Since Jessica is 24 now, Rachel had worked as his administrator then. Michael left the law firm to become a state judge a few years later, eventually moving to the state capital where his career flourished. Rachel, meanwhile, didn't pursue a romantic relationship with Michael, but stayed at the firm and eventually became the office manager. Despite the end of their affair, Michael and his wife Sarah became close friends with us, to the point where our children still referred to them as uncle and aunt. Their kids called me and Rachel the same. When I was away on business trips, Rachel and the kids would sometimes spend a few days at Michael and Sarah's lake house. This never raised any suspicions in my mind, and the kids even mentioned Aunt Sarah taking them places without me or Rachel. Clearly, I had missed some critical details. Lost in my thoughts, I suddenly heard Jessica calling out to me. I apologized, telling her I got lost in thought, and thanked her for her help, asking her to say hi to Jason, her husband, for me. Jessica then asked what I planned to do next. I admitted that I wasn't sure, and she advised me not to do anything incredibly stupid. She said a little foolishness was okay, but warned me against doing anything that might get me arrested. I hadn't considered harming Rachel until that moment, but I promised Jessica I wouldn't get myself arrested, which ruled out any violent thoughts. I never break promises to my kids. My first priority was to reassure Jessica about our relationship. Then, I needed to find out who Rachel's partner in crime was. The third task was to initiate divorce proceedings, but I needed a new lawyer since my current one was affiliated with the firm where Rachel worked. After meeting with a lawyer and getting things in order, I would then deal with my soon-to-be ex-wife, Rachel. The house felt cold and empty when Rachel and I were together. She talked non-stop, probably out of nerves, I suppose. She really tried to keep me content, thinking it might soften the blow when I eventually found out the truth. It's hard to be certain, but there was a growing distance between us, and she wasn't making any effort to close it. About a week later, I consulted with one attorney. As soon as he learned that my wife was the office manager at the law firm, he looked anxious, so I moved on to the next lawyer on my list, a young woman in her 20s named Laura Thompson. She simply smiled when I mentioned Rachel's position at the firm. This was the type of attorney I needed, someone who wouldn't be intimidated if one of the high-profile attorneys represented my wife. I shared what little I knew about the infidelity situation, starting with the revelation that my youngest child wasn't biologically mine, but Michael Johnson's Judge Michael Johnson of the Court of Appeals? Laura asked, raising an eyebrow. I nodded, closely watching her reaction to see if I should consider finding another lawyer. It must be quite a story, she remarked, and we delved into the financial aspects. Given our solid jobs, pensions, and benefits, Laura suggested splitting joint assets equally, retaining shares in our pensions, and selling the house. This would leave both of us financially comfortable, though I would have a slightly better position due to higher income and a better pension. Laura added that unless I was dead set on seeking revenge over my spouse's infidelity, we could settle things amicably. However, I replied that I didn't want to hurt her financially despite feeling wronged. Laura then asked about pursuing legal action against the judge, noting it would be much more complicated and time-consuming. I responded, perhaps a bit harshly, that the judge was my concern and I would handle it my way. Laura understood and suggested that if my spouse didn't contest, the issue could be resolved in 6 months. Otherwise, it might take more than a year. I told her I hadn't set any deadlines, so she should take her time and do it right. With the third task completed, it was time for the fourth, the confrontation. I waited another week to see if Rachel's conscience would compel her to confess. During that time, Saturday night, our usual date night arrived. We typically followed it with a movie and some intimate time, but I couldn't bring myself to go through with it given the circumstances. What I had learned was staggering. Rachel didn't question it, which was another sign she knew I was aware. She was quite skilled at putting on a facade, but that was about to change. I decided to take her to a fancy French restaurant where we enjoyed a bottle of wine and indulged in some delicious desserts. She seemed happier than she had been in weeks. Upon returning home, I carefully helped her out of her coat, guided her to the kitchen table, pulled out a chair for her, and said those dreaded words, "We need to talk." Rachel offered a half smile as I poured myself a Jack Daniels on the rocks and offered her a drink from the liquor cabinet, which she declined. Placing my drink on the table, I locked eyes with her and said, "The floor is yours." Rachel reminded me that it had been a long time since she and Michael were together, about 20 years, and asked if we could consider it a mistake from the distant past and move on. I was relieved she didn't dispute the DNA test's accuracy, but her attempt to brush it off as ancient history felt dismissive. I pressed for details, asking about the timeline and frequency of her involvement with Michael and whether our first 2 children, John and Emily, were also his. Rachel clarified that John and Emily were mine and that her involvement with Michael started about a year after Emily was born, lasting around 3 years. She explained it ended when Michael left the firm to pursue a judicial career, ensuring his background check was clean. After their breakup, they only had a few encounters at the lake house when Sarah took the kids out. Sarah was initially oblivious, but later learned the truth. Rachel mentioned a reconciliation meeting where she and Michael promised Sarah there would be no more intimacy. Frustrated, I asked Rachel why she never tried to have an honest conversation with me and if I was just a backup plan for her. She replied, wiping her hands on her sleeves, that she knew she could never tell me because I would have filed for divorce immediately. She claimed she loved me then and still does. I couldn't help but remark on her apparent love for Michael, noting that she started and stopped with him at his command, treating me as a contingency plan. Rachel desperately protested, insisting she loved me with all her heart. In response, I accused her of loving Michael with all her heart, sacrificing our relationship for his career while knowing I was her fallback option. I pointed out that while she might have had some love for me, she was aware of how much I idolized her and depended on our family to cope with his absence. Rachel's gaze falling to her knees seemed to confirm this painful truth. Regarding Jessica, Rachel confessed that during her affair with Michael, she hadn't considered the consequences until the DNA test revealed the truth. She assumed that since both she and Michael had brown hair, brown eyes, and fair skin, no one would suspect Jessica's paternity. She figured I wouldn't question it, especially since Jessica ended up resembling her, not knowing for sure until the DNA test. I exclaimed in disbelief, questioning if she was implying it was my fault. Rachel admitted that she and Michael had discussed the possibility that Jessica might be his child, but she reassured him not to worry since Jessica looked so much like me. She said Michael might not have known for certain, but he probably had figured it out by now. Rachel hadn't heard from him since Jessica and Jason's wedding 2 years ago. She emphasized that regardless of who knew what, Jessica was still her daughter. She insisted that Jessica was listed on the birth certificate. She had raised her, loved her, and considered her her own. Rachel firmly stated that Michael had better not even think about trying to claim Jessica, and that if he contacted me, I should make that clear to him. I told her I intended to have our other 2 children take DNA tests as soon as possible. I needed to know for my own peace of mind. Rachel pleaded with me, insisting that I already knew they were mine and asking why I couldn't trust her. My response was cold, my newfound distrust evident, and it seemed to take Rachel by surprise. She was deeply troubled by the thought of me revealing her infidelity to our other 2 children, understandably not wanting them to see her as unfaithful. Shifting the topic, I asked about the details of her affair, how often it happened, and where else they met. Rachel began to explain that their relationship had developed gradually from spending time together at work. They became friends, and then something more. She described Michael as kind, considerate, witty, funny, and passionate. They had a deep connection. Because they both had spouses they loved, they kept their meetings discreet, usually out of town, and never met at either of our houses as that would have crossed too many lines. Rachel whispered that they hadn't been intimate since the affair ended. When I asked if Sarah knew about all of this and had forgiven them, Rachel confirmed and reiterated that she had told me before. I whispered with uncertainty that I didn't think I could go back to how things were. Rachel tried to reassure me, acknowledging how wrong their actions were, but emphasizing that it had been over for 20 years, and I hadn't had to endure it while it was happening. She pleaded for us to return to the way things were just a few weeks ago when I was her loving husband, and she was my loving wife, insisting that nothing had to change. But I told her firmly that things had already changed. I explained that I had spent the better part of 3 weeks wondering what I had done wrong for her to fall in love with another man, and questioning whether I could ever fully trust her again, let alone stay married. With heavy emotion, I expressed that I had given her my heart completely, yet she treated it as something to be taken out only when it suited her. Our marriage wasn't supposed to be one of convenience, but a commitment of unwavering love. At this point, Rachel began to cry. Typically, I would try to console her, but this time felt different. I retreated to the family room, turned on the TV, and left her alone at the kitchen table. That night, we shared the same bed, but for the first time in a while, we didn't cuddle. I moved as far away from her as I could on the double bed and didn't let her snuggle up to me. When she climbed in, her face showed a mix of surprise and pain, but I didn't really care. On Sunday morning, as Rachel prepared a nice breakfast and we were eating, I brought up the topic of divorce. She practically yelled at me, arguing that the affair happened over 20 years ago and that I hadn't even known about it, urging that it was in the past and we should just move forward. In response, I shouted back, emphasizing that a mistake remains a mistake regardless of how long ago it occurred. I expressed my feelings of betrayal, highlighting how she deceived me, lied to me, and cheated on me, thereby violating my trust. These weren't temporary problems. Unable to continue the conversation, I got up from the table, leaving half my plate of food behind, and headed outside to mow the lawn. That was the last conversation I had with Rachel until Wednesday afternoon, when she informed me that Sarah Johnson would be joining us next weekend. Needless to say, I wasn't thrilled, but Sarah was an old and dear friend who had gone through the same cheating ordeal as I had, so I thought it was worth having a chat with her. On Friday night at 6:00, Sarah showed up, having traveled 2 hours from her house. Surprisingly, she didn't bring Michael with her. During dinner, our conversation remained light and friendly. Afterward, we moved to the family room with glasses of wine, presumably to delve into the main topic. Sarah began discussing the affair as if it were a distant historical event, speaking calmly and dispassionately. However, as she continued, her emotions intensified, and tears welled up in both hers and Rachel's eyes. Sarah shared that when Michael told her about the affair, she had assumed it had ended years ago, and he had assured her it wouldn't happen again. She admitted that she was devastated at first, but after giving it more thought, she came to realize that since it was over before she even knew about it, she guessed she wasn't hurt too badly. Knowing that Sarah wasn't some gold digger, I could see how it all unfolded. Michael's personality is quite captivating, isn't it? Although I only found out about Jessica a few weeks ago when everyone else did, I understand. I'm genuinely sorry about that, David. Sarah never brought up the few times Rachel and Michael met after their initial affair, particularly at the Johnson S. Lake house. I wondered if they had informed her about those occasions, but I didn't bother to ask. It did make me wonder, though, if Michael must be an excellent lawyer because Sarah seemed to be almost apologizing for his affair rather than being upset with him. Unfortunately for Rachel, I am not as settled as Sarah, and I am not as enthralled by her eloquence, so I wasn't inclined to give Rachel and Michael a pass like Sarah did. Even though their romance had spanned 2 decades, I often contemplate what my life would be like if I left her and how it would affect me and the kids. Sarah continued, They say you should always weigh whether your life would improve or worsen without your spouse. In my case, I believe it would be worse. Thank you for sharing your perspective with me, Sarah. It is definitely something to think about, and I'll need to carefully consider it. There are several factors at play, including the fact that, unlike you, I wasn't informed about the affair. I stumbled upon it entirely by accident. Rachel knew it was wrong when she was involved with Michael and anticipated my reaction. She believed it would be better for everyone if I never found out and just lived in ignorance. That would have been the case if it weren't for the DNA test. Now, 20 years later, Ivy discovered that the love of my life had an intimate relationship with another man before reverting back to me. During Sarah S.'s story, Rachel remained silent, merely listening as Sarah shared her narrative. Rachel couldn't have known that I was aware of her glances in my direction. I sat casually while Sarah spoke, just to mildly annoy Rachel. My response to Sarah S.'s story wasn't what Rachel had hoped for, and neither was Sarah S. They exchanged sorrowful glances, realizing that I wasn't reacting the way they had anticipated. I shook my head, went to the kitchen, poured myself another glass of wine, returned to the family room, and turned on the big screen. It was a clear signal that our conversation for the day was done. The ladies got the hint and moved to the living room where I could faintly hear them chatting. After finishing whatever I was watching, I switched off the TV, stuck my head into the living room, bid them goodnight, and headed upstairs to our bedroom. Sarah cornered me in the family room on Saturday, saying we needed to talk. I didn't know where Rachel was, but I agreed, and we relocated to the formal living room, settling into chairs in the corner. Sarah began by expressing understanding of my pain, but argued that not forgiving Rachel and divorcing her would be a big mistake for both of us. She emphasized that our love for each other should be what matters most, and that the past is history. She pointed out the tragedy it would be for us to spend the rest of our lives apart over something that happened 20 years ago, mentioning that if she could forgive Michael, I could surely forgive Rachel too. I responded honestly to Sarah, admitting that I didn't know if I could ever forgive Rachel. I pointed out that unlike her situation where she was informed about the affair, Rachel had kept me in the dark. Rachel knew what she was doing was wrong and had hidden it from me because she knew I wouldn't have forgiven her back then, so I couldn't see why I should forgive her now. The weight of her deception was immense. She hadn't just cheated on me for a few years, she had continued to lie and deceive me for over 2 decades. How could I ever trust her again? I shook my head, stood up, and walked out of the room, passing Rachel in the hallway. She could see from my expression that I wasn't budging an inch. Dinner on Saturday night was painfully silent. The women tried to make small talk, but I wasn't interested. I barely spoke 3 words throughout the meal. After a brief thank you, I grabbed my jacket and left, telling them I'd be at Malone S., my favorite spot for a quiet drink. At Malone S., feeling down, I chose a table instead of my usual place at the bar. The bar owner, who was like a sister to me, noticed my mood and urged me to talk. I confided in her that my wife, Rachel, had cheated and that our youngest child might not be mine. Outraged, she supported me, offering her blunt perspective, which I valued. She questioned whether Rachel had apologized for the affair itself or just for getting caught. I realized Rachel hadn't truly apologized. The bar owner offered me free drinks and arranged a cab, taking my keys for safety. The cab dropped me off at home around 2:00 in the morning. Rachel greeted me at the door and helped me up to our bedroom. I collapsed into bed fully clothed, and Rachel took off my shoes and socks. That's how I slept. Late on Wednesday night, my son called me at the office. He wanted to talk about Rachel S.'s situation, though he didn't explicitly say it. It was clear that Rachel had involved the kids to sway me away from the divorce. My son and I usually agreed on most things, but from our conversation, it became apparent that Rachel had put in significant effort and it had paid off, as he clearly empathized with her side of the divorce dilemma. I explained to him firmly that what she did initially could be seen as a mistake, but continuing the affair for months turned it into a choice. I asked him how he'd feel if he found out his wife, Jessica, was cheating. While the affair ended years ago, the deceit and disrespect didn't. I felt John should have stayed out of our issues. He was taking sides and getting involved in something he shouldn't. I was frustrated, feeling betrayed after idolizing my wife only to find out she kept this secret. If not for a certain accident, I'd still be in the dark. It felt like she used me as a backup plan. As John tried to argue that I was overreacting, I hung up, feeling the conversation wasn't going anywhere. When I got home around 6:00 in the evening, Rachel was already busy preparing a delicious meal. She didn't look pleased when I mentioned I wasn't hungry. I poured myself a glass of Jack Daniels, turned on the TV, and settled into my favorite chair. She came in and asked what was wrong. Same old stuff, different day. My wife cheats on me for 4 years, has a kid with another guy, and now my kids are making me out to be the bad guy here. Do me a favor, call Kathy tonight and tell her not to call me tomorrow unless she wants to be hung up on like John. Rachel lowered her eyes. You'd think after 31 years she'd know not to provoke me on her behalf. What makes you think the divorce won't happen? I said, raising my voice. Not only did you cheat on me for 4 years and have a child with another man, but you also replaced me in your heart. You can sit here and tell me that you weren't in love with him, and that if he had asked you to divorce me and marry him, you wouldn't have done it, I said. The truth is, you may love me, but you are not in love with me. You are in love with him. I am just a dependable backup because you've always known my heart belongs to you, and I'd do anything to keep you as mine. You cheated on me, lied to me, disrespected me, and now you have the nerve to try to turn our children against me. That was the final straw, Rachel. But I won to be vengeful towards you, especially not to Sarah. And I won to destroy Michael S.'s promising career as an upstanding judge. I'm going to file for divorce citing irreconcilable differences. We can each keep our retirement accounts while splitting everything else, including the house, right down the middle. As tears streamed down Rachel's cheeks and she got up from her chair, I couldn't help but add another jab. You never mentioned regretting your affair, probably because you don't regret it. The only thing you regret is that I found out, isn't it? The rest of the night was spent in the company of a bottle of Jack Daniels. The following day, I contacted my attorney and told her to prepare the divorce papers as quickly as possible. She mentioned that I could review them the coming Tuesday and they'd be ready for Wednesday. Rachel could be served on Thursday, but I insisted that the process server come to my house on Friday night. I wanted to be present when she received the papers. Next, I made a call to Judge Michael Johnson S. office, letting his receptionist know that I needed him to return my call regarding an important matter. The receptionist understood the urgency of my call, and I was sure Michael would call back promptly. When Michael did call back a couple of hours later, he sounded uneasy. He knew precisely what I was getting at, but preferred not to handle it at his office. I readily agreed and told him I'd be at his house the following Saturday at 10:00 a.m. He didn't know yet that Rachel would be served the night before, although I was certain he'd find out by the time I made the 2-hour drive to his upscale residence. During dinner at Malone S. on Saturday night, Rachel mentioned that Sarah had called her, informing her of my upcoming meeting with Michael the following Saturday. Rachel wanted to know if I'd like her to accompany me. I pointed out that this wasn't just casual conversation. Michael and I had serious matters to discuss, and her presence wasn't necessary. I reminded her that he was an appellate court judge with a sterling reputation, possibly in contention for a Supreme Court judgeship. Any confrontational behavior could lead to legal consequences. Besides, she had promised not to do anything detrimental to his career. Rachel retorted with a hint of jealousy, but I reassured her that I intended to keep my promise and not jeopardize Michael S.'s career prospects. After confiding in a senior colleague at the office about my situation, I took a few personal hours to meet with my attorney and review the divorce papers. I gave her the green light. As I was about to leave, she inquired if I had any plans concerning Judge Michael. Puzzled, I asked why she was concerned. She replied, "Because I still handle some criminal cases, and I thought you might need a good lawyer. You engineers may not get too emotional about many things, but your methodical approach can be intimidating." She handed me her business card, and I exited her office. The next 3 days went by in a flash. We had a major project underway at the office, which gave me a chance to divert my attention away from my personal life. Even the old man in the office remarked on my remarkable focus despite the turmoil I was going through. I replied, telling him that I believed at least one thing was going smoothly. However, on Friday evening before I left, I confided in him about Rachel being served with divorce papers and my impending meeting with Michael. I warned him that if things went awry, I might end up in jail by Monday. He assured me of his support and pledged to provide bail money if needed. We parted ways with a firm handshake. Returning home, I was greeted by the enticing aroma of yet another delicious meal that Rachel was preparing. Lately, she had been going out of her way to showcase her culinary talents, and I had to admit she was an excellent cook. Despite the strained atmosphere that had characterized our meals for the past few weeks, I made sure to express my gratitude for the wonderful dinner. After all, I wasn't about to be ungrateful. Following dinner, as we were about to head to the family room for some television time, the doorbell rang. It was nearly 7:00, and I had a hunch it wasn't tea for me. I stayed where I was. Rachel gave me a quick look before going to answer the door. A well-dressed young man stood at the door and asked if she was Rachel Walters. When she confirmed, he handed her a manila envelope and said, "You've been served," then quickly walked away. Rachel stood frozen, her shoulders slumping as tears welled up in her eyes. I walked past her, closed the front door, and gently guided her to the kitchen table. She looked completely shaken, exactly as I had expected. We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, though it was only 5 minutes. Finally, she muttered, "You," and fled upstairs to our bedroom. I chose not to follow her. The hardest part was behind me. For one of the few times since we got married, I didn't sleep in the same bed as Rachel that night. Instead, I stayed in the guest bedroom, but calling it sleep would be an exaggeration. The woman I had once considered my soulmate, my everything, was still under the same roof despite everything that had happened. I suppose neither of us wanted to be the first to leave, but now, at least in my mind, it was all over. The next morning I got up, showered, and dressed quietly, making sure not to disturb Rachel or provoke any confrontation. I didn't check if she was awake, I just gathered my things and left. I wore my usual outfit, a collared shirt, a good pair of Levi S jeans, and the custom-made cowboy boots with metal tips that I got during a visit to our son in Dallas. I left earlier than necessary to ensure I wasn't too late for the meeting. If I arrived early, I'd spend some time at a nearby cafe, which is exactly what I did. I got to Michael and Sarah S. house at exactly 10:00 and rang the doorbell. Sarah, always looking lovely but clearly nervous, opened the door. All I could manage to say was, "I am sorry it had to come to this," as she leaned in for a hug. She didn't respond with words, but took my hand and led me into the room where Michael kept his memorabilia and photos. Michael was seated in his favorite chair, but as we walked in, he stood up. "Hey, David. Hey, Michael." Sarah, looking quite tense, left the room. We stood about 6 feet apart, sizing each other up. There was a time when I considered this man almost like an older brother, that is, how close we were. Michael was 2 years older than me, about the same height, but the comforts of the past 20 years had added about 30 pounds, most of it settling in his round belly. We had shared hopes and dreams, gone on countless adventures together, fished and hunted side by side. I used to be proud to call him my friend and admired his achievements as a judge, but now, standing before me, his gaze was no longer that of a friend but an enemy. I felt a surge of anger. "You've got my wife's heart, you bastard!" I yelled. "You also get to keep your spotless reputation because I promised Rachel I wouldn't tell anyone about this, and I don't break promises to her. But you won to keep your manhood." With that, I took a big step forward with my left foot, planted my right foot, and delivered a powerful upward kick aimed at his groin. Michael S.'s reaction was slower than I expected, and my metal-tipped boot hit its mark perfectly. I felt his pain as I kicked him, and then heard him howl in agony as he crumpled to the floor, clutching his groin and crying out like a wounded animal. In that moment, all the rage and frustration boiled over. Sarah rushed in, seeing her husband writhing in pain on the floor. She tried to comfort him, but his screams only grew louder. She looked at me with fear in her eyes. I reached for my cell phone, dialed 911, and calmly said, "There's been an accident at Judge Michael Johnson S. house. We need an ambulance." I turned to leave, but just as I reached the door, Sarah grabbed my arm. I thought I might have to defend myself, but instead of panic or anger, there was a strangely calm expression on her face. She hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you. We understand what needs to be done." I hugged her back, left the house, got in my car, and drove home, confident that the police wouldn't be coming after me. Sarah understood, and she'd explain it to Michael when he could think clearly. The drive home brought a mix of relief and maybe a gut punch, who knows. After months of daily heartbreak, I finally felt unburdened. It's funny how realizing Rachel's betrayal actually loosened her grip on my heart, allowing me to think clearly and do what was best for me. It might not have been the right choice for everyone, but sometimes you got to prioritize your own well-being. That's what everyone else had done for the past 2 decades, so why shouldn't I? Sure, a part of me would always love Rachel, but I wasn't going to dwell on this chapter any longer. It wasn't my fault, and it wasn't my choice. It was time to move forward. Once I got home, I headed to the basement, grabbed a couple of suitcases, and made my way to our bedroom. Rachel followed me from the family room asking, "That's it then?" "That's it," I replied. 31 years and out the door, Rachel. It's a shame you're so wrapped up in yourself that you can see how you deceived me, how you stole 24 years of my love through your deception. But I have moved past it, and I don't hate you. I don't even hate Michael, though that poor guy probably thinks I do now. I'll mend things with John and Emily down the road. You should patch things up with Jessica as soon as you can. Those girls are missing out. Sign the papers, Rachel, and let us put this behind us, I continued. I'll have the rest of my things out of here in the next few days. We don't need to talk anymore. If you have anything to say to me, I left my lawyer's business card on the kitchen table. She stood there in shock, tears welling up, but no words came. I grabbed my suitcases, went back downstairs, and stashed them in the trunk of my car. After returning to the house, I packed up my belongings and departed. 31 years, just like that, the end. I lied. As it turns out, Michael managed to save one of his testicles after all. It required extensive surgery and months of pain, but they succeeded in saving one. I learned about it from Jessica, who had been contacted by Sarah trying to reach me. Sarah didn't have my phone number, and the rest of the family had no interest in informing me. In fact, they haven't spoken to me for 8 months now, but I've come to terms with it. According to the official version, Judge Michael had a mishap in his office, falling onto the corner of his fancy desk, and had a rough landing twice, ending up on the floor. The media played it down, calling it a domestic accident and sparing the details of the injury to his sensitive area. Surprisingly, he received a lot of sympathetic coverage. I guess even this one to hinder his chances of making it onto the Supreme Court shortlist. Rachel signed the divorce papers in just a week, and last week the divorce was officially finalized. The house will be auctioned off. Rachel hasn't attempted to reach out to me since I left, and neither have John or Kathy. It seems like I won to be joining the family Christmas dinner wherever they decided to have it. The old man is passing the company reins to me come the new year as he heads into retirement. Per the agreement, I'll have to run the company for 7 years before I can retire comfortably with a substantial golden parachute. Afterward, he plans to find a buyer for the company, and I'll get a 10 cut of that deal too. I've started going out and dating again. After being married for what felt like an eternity, it'll take some time to remember how all of that works. Interestingly, news of my divorce spread quickly, and quite a few divorced friends reached out expressing interest. Even a couple of Rachel's divorced friends called, surprised that she let me go at all. I must admit, it's been a nice boost to my ego. I see a promising life ahead filled with professional and personal challenges. During my free time away from work, I am exploring new hobbies. One thing I have given up on is genealogy. I used to be into it, but it's no longer a pursuit of mine.